When we discuss 15th century art, often we spotlight Italy and Flanders, focusing on Florence, Bruges, Brussels. And I've done that over the past 3 episodes, looking at these 2 geographical extremes on the European continent. But at the same time, artists are interacting all around Europe, beyond Europe, and between artistic media. These stylistic dialogues are happening in tandem with major developments in politics and society. Modern colonialism is born in the late 15th century with the Age of Discovery, spearheaded by Spain and Portugal. Religious conflict in Spain culminates in the Inquisition, and Gutenberg's invention of the printing press around 1440 leads to increases in literacy, the dissemination of knowledge, and the advent of printmaking as a new democratic form of communication. Printmaking then grows to converse with painting, sculpture, and the decorative arts. In this episode, we use 3 lenses to explore these cross-currents, tracing how each shaped the art and politics of 15th century Europe. To lead us into our discussion of the Iberian Peninsula, I want to show you this Madonna and Child by Filippino Lippi, because it shows us how stories of intercultural interaction, or sometimes subjugation, are hidden in the background. This is a picture with a very standard subject matter, but it hides details that complicate the traditional narrative of the Renaissance. What strikes me immediately is the rich, dazzling blue of Mary's robes. This pigment is called ultramarine. It's ground from lapis lazuli, which was sourced from a single mine in Afghanistan, a reminder of the flourishing network of trade between Europe and Asia at this time. Ultramarine was the priciest pigment on the market, speaking to the wealth of Filippino's patron. And it's usually reserved for the most important passages in any painting, such as the robes of the Virgin Mary. But look closely beyond the foreground. A black fisherman on our left, and a female black servant on our right. They attest to the presence of slaves in Renaissance Florence, imported from sub-Saharan Africa through the Iberian Peninsula. It was common for Florentine nobles to own slaves in the 15th century. Now, slavery was far from a new concept in Europe at this time. The slave trade had been very active throughout the medieval period, when Venice had been a major hub for slave merchants, but those slaves were predominantly from Eastern Europe or from Western Asia, not from Africa. It wasn't until the Portuguese reached the West African coast in the late 15th century that a new slave trade and a new chapter in history and art history began. The extent of trade, commerce, and intercultural interaction during this period raises questions about the Renaissance European worldview. What did Europeans think of Asia, Africa, these faraway lands? How did they envision them? Each 15th century voice would obviously give a different answer to this question, but there is a document that offers us some insight into their conception of the world. This manuscript from the Morgan is called A Book of Marvels, one of many fantasy travelogues surveying various exotic lands, quote-unquote, from Ethiopia to the Sudan to Libya to India. And it's part of a tradition that includes Marco Polo's legendary trip to, allegedly, the Mongol court of Kublai Khan around the 1270s. And like that voyage, the contents and imagery you find in Books of Marvels are heavily embellished, romanticized. Take, for example, this folio. We see an arid landscape with a distant city. There are dragons and enormous horned birds and primitive apes and this hairy, large-eared man. But you've probably noticed an even odder group of creatures, these headless men called blemmies, whom Marco Polo also mentions as having seen, possibly misrepresentations of warriors who kept their heads close to their chests. Blemmies are variously described as inhabiting northern Africa, western Asia, even the Himalayas, but certain medieval maps place them in Ethiopia, and indeed, this illustration is supposed to be of the Ethiopian highlands. If you leaf through some other folios, you'll see that these fascinating landscapes and a lot of the fantastic beasts are actually very similar for locations as far away as Scandinavia, here Norway, or elsewhere in Africa, Asia, etc. So really, these are representations of a certain other, a generic Western European vision of somewhere foreign, somewhere perhaps dangerous. Long-distance travel was of course difficult, and for most Europeans, impossible in the 15th century. So books of marvels like this one would have been their window into distant worlds. But there was a European kingdom that set off to actually explore unknown lands rather than simply imagine them. Portugal. Having been geographically isolated from the devastation of plague, Portugal had the financial means and desire to explore particularly Africa. For one, it wanted trade routes that bypassed Muslim-ruled territories in northern Africa. For another, gold had been pouring out of the Mali Empire under the medieval ruler Mansa Musa, and there was the tantalizing question of where exactly this gold was being mined. Plus, there was the legend of Prester John, this immensely wealthy Christian king ruling in Ethiopia, so it's not hard to understand this abiding interest in Africa. Spearheading the Portuguese campaign was Prince Henry the Navigator, and under his auspices, a new type of sailing ship was developed, the caravel, whose triangular sails allowed it to sail against the wind. So it's this combination of technology and politics that paved the way for the Age of Discovery. Under this context, it's interesting to look at 15th century Portuguese art made for the royal court. This polyptych by the Portuguese master Nuno Gonçalves is one of the most fascinating works of Renaissance painting, as well as the most confusing. It was likely made to celebrate Portuguese discoveries in Africa, and it honors Vincent, the patron saint of Lisbon. He's the richly clad guy in red. Aside from this, there's really very little that's agreed upon. When we're assessing a polyptych, we need to consider the panels holistically. Is there a continuous narrative, a continuous sense of space, recurring motifs, repeated figures? Now, this is a hypothetical arrangement where there is no clear continuity. The colors, the sense of space, it's not entirely logical across these 6 panels. We also don't know the original number of panels. 6 of them are here only because they survived, but there might have been more. So what do we know? Well, I mentioned Henry the Navigator as playing the central role in initiating and sponsoring these voyages. So it's only natural that we start by looking for him. And there's a contemporary portrait of him that helps us, this frontispiece. So see if you can find him. If you said Henry is this man, so did most people for centuries. The resemblance is undeniable, and you look across the saint, and this woman should be his wife. That's how they're typically arranged. That is the first of several problems that arises about the identification of these figures. Henry never married, and so this arrangement doesn't make sense. His brother, however, Edward, the King of Portugal, did marry, and brothers probably look similar, so it's more likely this man is actually King Edward with his son and grandson. Instantly, the tone of the polyptych changes. It becomes a royal family portrait with St. Vincent symbolizing Portugal at large. We can look to another panel with strikingly individualized faces, which is the one called the panel of the knights, the one on the right, where these men look out at us, and the lowermost figure kneeling in prayer looks toward the king and St. Vincent. We see his gray hair because, unlike the others, he has no noble headdress. The two behind him have white gloves on, symbolizing purity, but he's bare-handed, pointing to dirtiness or guilt. Look at the hilt of his sword. It's decorated with black thread rather than the vibrant gold of the others. It's cheaper, less than. Incidentally, King Edward had 4 brothers. That, of course, included Henry the Navigator. So if these are the 4 brothers, then Henry's one of these 4. Now, the royal politics of the time were complicated by the fact that Henry had gone against one of his siblings in a military alliance. He had his enemies in the court. If this work was indeed commissioned by the court, it's possible that Henry, also the youngest brother, was intentionally reduced to a more humiliating, suppliant position like that of the purple-robed figure. So the St. Vincent panels are an interesting primary source of the Portuguese Renaissance, very much open to interpretation. In celebrating the voyages, we'd expect a spotlight on Henry the Navigator, but due to family politics, he's marginalized, and King Edward takes the credit. This was the beginning of an age of colonialism whose ramifications still haunt our modern world. Upon reaching the West African coast, the peoples of Guinea and the Kingdom of Benin, the Portuguese built a powerful commercial network transacting both goods and slaves. Coveted elephant ivory was exported out of Africa, for example, in return for brass metal. As a result, in the 16th century, we see the incorporation of brass into the art of the Kingdom of Benin. But we also see Portuguese merchants and European iconography making appearances in the native art of this region. This device was made in what's now Sierra Leone for export to Europe. It's meant to hold salt, which seems commonplace now, but was then an expensive commodity that you'd want to show off at your kitchen table. and it reflects a shared interest between the Portuguese and sub-Saharan African cultures, an interest in mysticism and spirituality, ideas symbolized by the snakes and dogs carved here. By 1500, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama had sailed beyond Africa to India, erecting pillars like this one to claim territory along the way, initiating a spice trade and solidifying Portugal's maritime trading post empire. This map was made by a Portuguese cartographer in the first years of the 16th century. It's the first ever to show Portuguese discoveries in both Asia and the Americas. We see Brazil, which had just been explored in 1500, and India, alongside the Caribbean, Greenland, and a very detailed depiction of Africa. On the west coast of Africa, you can even see this palace. It's a Portuguese trading post, the Elmina Castle, in what's now Ghana. Maps like these were highly coveted, classified information. They revealed where riches and resources were located overseas, and they were national trade secrets. Leaking them was punishable by death. Gradually, though, this courtly culture of secrecy became undermined by a network of undercover agents working for foreign European states. This particular map was smuggled by one such agent, Cantino, who lends his name to the map. Cantino smuggled it to Ferrara, where the Este ruling family wanted in on the newest information about Portugal's voyages. In Italy, it came to serve as a model for future maps featuring the New World. East of Portugal, Spain was reckoning with its own set of upheavals and ambitions. There was religious conflict and political strife arising from multicultural dynamics. Spain was also interested in reaping the legendary riches of the New World, but unsurprisingly, its expansionary ambitions clashed with Portugal's. We see this blue vertical line on the Cantino Planisphere. This is a boundary set by a 1494 treaty that gave Spain all land to the west and Portugal all the land to the east in an attempt to resolve territorial disputes. This pattern of international competition would come to define exploration in the coming centuries. But backing up a bit, in 1450, Spain was not yet united. It consisted of several puzzle pieces, the Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, plus the Muslim Emirate of Granada. Generally, the Spanish courts had a strong taste for early Netherlandish painting, just as in Italy, slightly later. King John II of Castile, for instance, was a keen admirer of Jan van Eyck, and all his life he wanted to own one, but Van Eyck died before he had a chance. The next best thing for John was Roger van der Weyden. So the Miraflores Altarpiece is John's commission from Roger. This triptych was to Castile, essentially as the Portinari triptych was to Florence, greatly admired and inspiring many, many copies. It offers a synopsis of Christ's life using color as a narrative device. Try following the Virgin's robes and notice how they change in color from left to right. Initially, they're white, pure, and young as the Virgin adores the Christ child in her lap. In the central scene, her robes switch colors to red, now emblematic of blood and suffering. Then, when the resurrected Christ visits her, she's in blue, grief, but also unyielding grit and strength. All three scenes are framed by these fantastic Gothic arches. Works like the Miraflores Altarpiece become an anchor of reference for Spanish painters developing their own vocabularies later in the century. So Roger's triptych was commissioned for the crown of Castile, as I mentioned. A unified Spain wouldn't exist until Isabella of Castile eloped with her second cousin, Ferdinand of Aragon. Ferdinand and Isabella are often remembered as the Catholic monarchs because they aimed to firmly establish Spain as a Catholic stronghold, viewing all other faiths as heretical. Spain had a sizable Jewish population, and Muslim-ruled regions in the peninsula, collectively called Al-Andalus, had existed since the 8th century. Indeed, the influence of Islamic culture is especially apparent in Spanish architecture and decorative arts. 15th century pottery from Valencia in southern Spain, for instance, has markedly Islamic vegetal motifs. So the Iberian Peninsula was very much a multicultural, multilingual, multi-religious community. But by establishing the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, Ferdinand and Isabella gave an ultimatum to all non-Catholics in Spain: either convert or face expulsion. In 1492, the Catholic monarchs waged war on the Muslim Emirate of Granada and won, ending the last Muslim dynasty on the Iberian Peninsula. In the same year, they sponsored Columbus's journey to the Americas. And by conquering Granada, they united Spain. In this chaotic political context, Saint Dominic becomes a popular figure in Spanish Catholic art. Dominic, who founded the Dominican order of friars in the 13th century, had converted a sect of heretical Christians in southern France, the Albigenses, to mainstream Catholicism. As you can see why he might be symbolically relevant in the context of the Inquisition. In this panel, the Castilian painter Pedro Berruguete anachronistically integrates Saint Dominic into a portrayal of the late 15th century Inquisition, where Dominic now becomes an inquisitor, presiding over the execution of heretics by burning, part of a trial called the auto da fe. These were public spectacles, ignominious deaths. Dominican teachings were promoted heavily during the Inquisition in hopes of converting people, just as Dominic had done with the Albigensian heretics. Berruguete's picture contributes to that cause, while doubling as a grim visual warning against heresy. Now, did the Inquisition provide a favorable environment for artistic flourishing? Not really. It created a very tense atmosphere that delayed bursts of artistic patronage in Spain and Portugal to the 16th century. So although so much of Renaissance humanism was built on the multilingual work of scholars and translators working in medieval Al-Andalus or Muslim Spain, the Renaissance came late to the Iberian Peninsula. Bartolomé Bermejo from the Andalusian city of Córdoba was really the first great Spanish master of oils, but even he had run-ins with the Inquisition. We think he was actually a converso, a convert from Judaism. His wife certainly was, and that put them at risk of trial. Bermejo was also an unreliable artist, so unreliable that he was excommunicated from the church because he failed to complete a commission in time. But his skill was also so unrivaled in Spain that his excommunication had to be lifted because he was needed for another commission. In this fragment of Apocalyptic, Bermejo shows Saint Michael, the archangel who slew the devil, defeating evil. It's a metaphor for the Christian victory in Spain. Michael is enormous in comparison to the diminutive donor kneeling below, and look at his gem-studded armor. He holds a magnificent shield, dazzling robes of red and gold. Bermejo has decorated the gold leaf with semicircular indentations to create the texture of a finely woven textile. The realism of this texture and the sensitive lighting on those creases and folds, greatly indebted to Rogier van der Weyden, attest to Bermejo's facility with oil paint. Michael here is about to deliver the final blow, and just look at the creature. The devil is an imaginative fusion of animal parts, the wings of a butterfly, the tail of a crocodile. The wings are a reminder that Satan too was an angel once, but he rebelled against God and so fell from heaven. Beside the beast are poppies, symbolic of blood and death, and look at the creature's eyes. Bermejo seems to have modeled them after the poppies too. This is the apogee of 15th century Spanish painting. So from the 1450s onward, Portugal is turning overseas to Africa and eventually South and Southeast Asia, and Spanish artists find themselves embroiled in the Inquisition while looking to the Flemish masters. There's also plenty of exchange on the other side of the Pyrenees, dialogues across the Alps that weren't limited to Bruges, Florence, and Brussels. And I want to take a look at some of these here. Take, for example, the northern Italian city of Ferrara. In episode 2, we saw Pisanello's vision of St. Eustace, an ode to nature, and to capturing its beauty with the poetics of painting. Pisanello had been hired by Leonello d'Este, the Marquis of Ferrara, and brought the International Gothic to the Ferrarese court. And from the 1440s onward, the ruling Este family in Ferrara sought to rival the Medici family in Florence in terms of artistic patronage, tying together loose transalpine trends to bring a unique and eclectic Renaissance to Ferrara. Ferrara itself is a university town. The university is established in 1391 by an Este, but it's barely operational at that point. When Leonello d'Este comes into power in the 1440s, he decides to reform the institution. He hires professors in philosophy and medicine and so forth, lending new scholarship and energy to the university and thus the city. Ferrara becomes a center for humanist learning. Leonello himself is an accomplished academic, well-respected humanist in his own right, and he's very well connected, so it's not entirely unexpected to see the Este coat of arms on the reverse of this portrait, whose austerity is characteristic of the late Rogier van der Weyden. This stern young man holds a ring and a hammer. We're not sure what they mean, but judging from the date and the Este identity, he's probably Leonello's illegitimate son, Francesco, who had been in Burgundy for military training. This portrait implies that Rogier's work served as a vehicle for Transalpine artistic dialogue, his influence bringing to Ferrara not only the early Netherlandish tradition, but the oil technique at large. So Leonello d'Este wants to elevate Ferrara to the position of Florence, and that necessitated boosting Ferrara's cultural profile. And it's this spirit of competition among Italian city-states that drives so much of Renaissance patronage, ambition, conversation, and innovation. That's the key. It should come as no surprise, then, that Leonello builds his dream countryside palazzo to rival Michelozzo's Palazzo Medici. The scholarly and spiritual core of a late 15th century Italian palace was its studiolo, a private study for contemplation. Leonello, of course, wanted a very erudite one, and he decides to decorate his with 9 pictures of the Greek muses, goddesses who inspired the arts. His palazzo itself has long been destroyed, but the paintings survive, and among them, this muse, stands out for its striking, imposing presence. It's by the court painter Cosmè Tura, and from the cherry branch she holds, we think she's Calliope, the muse of epic poetry. Look at this unusual palette of color. The green and red marble of Calliope's majestic throne, the red and gold lacing on her sleeve, the red and green of her cloak, the gold of the mythical dragon-like beasts with rubies for eyes. We think they're actually dolphins, emblems of the Este. And then the many shades of blue in the sky. Tura's Muse is among the first major Italian Renaissance paintings done in oil paint, which would later become the standard medium in Italy. Tura attempts to mix his Italian training with Rogier van der Weyden's influential, austere Flemish style to a somewhat awkward effect. But the symbolic iconography that abounds in this picture and the sculptural quality of Calliope's robes point to a strong awareness of early Netherlandish painting, and it reveals just how powerful and far-reaching Rogier's influence was. In Ferrara's particular case, the Este family, the patrons, were the ones to facilitate artistic exchange with Flanders. But other times, artists made this transalpine journey themselves. These travels were the Renaissance analogues of years abroad. In the 16th century, they became customary for German artists and craftsmen, known as a Wanderjahre, or wandering year. And if you watched Season 1, Episode 2, you saw the great German painter and printmaker Albrecht Dürer travel throughout his native Germany and Flanders and Venice. But 5 decades before Dürer, the French court artist Jean Fouquet undertook a similar journey to Rome. Fouquet was from Tours, southwest of Paris, and in cities like this, artistic production focused on illuminated manuscripts and woven tapestries, which were in vogue at the French court. So Fouquet, like Jan van Eyck in Flanders, was trained as an illuminator, which provided an excellent foundation for painting. Fouquet travels to Rome around 1445, and the Rome he saw was very, very different from the developed city we know today. It was pretty much an archaeological site. The Vatican had only been declared the sole official seat of the papacy in the 1410s, so it wasn't until Fouquet's time that popes became interested in promoting Rome as a center of Catholic culture. When Fouquet arrived, the Pope at the time, Eugene IV, had just commissioned new decorations for the old St. Peter's Basilica, a building that dated back to ancient Roman times. Fra Angelico, who had just done the San Marco frescoes in Florence, was hired for the job, and we know Fouquet ends up with Fra Angelico in St. Peter's working on frescoes. Unfortunately, their work was lost with the 16th century demolition of this old basilica to make way for the new St. Peter's that we see today. But this serendipitous collaboration exposed Fouquet, no doubt, to Italian methods of treating space, to linear perspective. When he returned to France, receiving the patronage of the imperial advisor and treasurer Etienne Chevalier, Fouquet produces this seminal work of early French painting. It shows the patron Etienne Chevalier in prayer. Next to him is a saint holding a lustrous rock, or as recently proposed, a prehistoric hand axe, some sort of shiny crystalline object, identifying him as Saint Stephen, who was stoned to death. Blood runs from his head. The two figures are situated before classical columns with these colorful marble inlays, something Fouquet must have seen in Rome. Certainly he's learned the technique of perspective with a horizon line and spatial recession. The saint's face is idealized. Your eyes travel smoothly from his eyebrows to his gaze and down his nose to the contours of his lips and chin. The likeness of Etienne Chevalier on the other side is strikingly naturalistic, not unlike a Van Eyck portrait. The fingers themselves are a study in lighting. From the fur lining of his cuff to the subtle shading on the knuckles and the highlights on the nails, Chevalier's praying hands feel tangible. But who's he praying to? This is actually half of a diptych. The other wing was sold separately. Originally, he would have been admiring the Virgin and Child in majesty. Everything about the right-hand wing feels heavenly. Palette of vibrant, unnatural colors, those saturated and almost garish reds and blues of the cherubim or guardian angels. And then the pale gray and pink highlights on the Virgin's skin, the almost metallic feel of the Christ child. Fouquet introduces us to an otherworldly space here. It's not meant to be earthly, not meant to be realistic. It's an elegant, divine fantasy. The Melun diptych is Fouquet's only signed work. He must have been proud of this absolute tour de force, and rightly so. 15th century European politics was a tangled mess based on complex inheritances. Marriages united so many noble families across different territories that land claims could become hilariously messy. But in terms of art history, the weird and tortuous encounters that resulted from rulers claiming different thrones often facilitated stylistic diffusion. We've now seen an example of patrons like the Este facilitating exchange across geographies. We've seen artists like Jean Fouquet make physical trips to study Italian art in his case. And here we'll see an example of stylistic diffusion as an unexpected byproduct of political messiness. René, the Duke of Anjou, was born in France to an Aragonese mother and a French father. But his father was actually the adopted son of the Queen of Naples, and by extension, he would have been a king of Naples. And so René claimed the Neapolitan throne. And in doing so, he brings Northern European art to southern Italy for the first time. Antonello da Messina, an artist from Sicily living in Naples, was a pupil of René's court painter in Naples, who worked in a Flemish style, and so Antonello was trained in the early Netherlandish tradition. This stern depiction of the Virgin and Child features a pomegranate, whose red seeds associated with blood foreshadow Christ's crucifixion. It was long thought to be Flemish. The floating angels in particular suggested it, but also the crown and the Virgin's gem-studded robes, which emulate the minute detail and meticulous lighting you find in a Van Eyck. It's also done in oil, using the wet-on-wet technique that Van Eyck pioneered. So Antonello is trained to have this Flemish skill set, but he's also determined to master the Italian science of linear perspective. So he goes to Venice in the 1470s in search of new opportunities. Venice is, of course, this cosmopolitan nexus of trade, a crossroads between East and West, but also a city with access to both sides of the Alps. And I think that's why Antonello was so greatly excited by Venice, as opposed to Florence, for example. Venice allowed him access to Northern Europe more readily. And when he traveled there, he brought this jewel to advertise his talents to potential patrons. We're entering the private study of St. Jerome, a priest and historian who translated the Bible into Latin. He's seen in profile in the robes and chair of a cardinal, reading, in a space that's already executed with a firm grasp of depth and natural lighting. In the foreground, we see a partridge and a peacock, allusions to Christ, salvation, and the afterlife. Beside them sits a basin of water, perhaps to satisfy the thirst of the animals, but also perhaps suggestive of baptism. As we walk through the archway and enter the space, we're met with Jerome's shoes, which he's left at the foot of the stairs that lead onto the platform, suggestive of the study being a sacred space. 2 pots of plants adorn his workspace. You can just make out some geraniums. Further to the left, we see a sleeping cat, which for me adds this warm, bubbly serenity to the picture. The study itself is exquisite. Books, some open with fluttering pages, others closed, lie scattered messily on the shelves. A porcelain vase, keys. Affixed to the top of the shelves, a small wooden statue of Christ on the cross. On Jerome's desk, a quill pen sits in an ink pot waiting to be used. To the right of the platform, under a barrel-vaulted walkway, a lion approaches us. This is the lion that St. Jerome is said to have tamed in the wilderness after removing a thorn from its paw. It's Jerome's signature attribute. Also extraordinary is the lovely landscape we see outside the window. 2 people walk their dog, while 2 more row by on boat. A fisherman stands patiently, waiting for a catch on the river shore, and farther away, just outside the city walls, 2 equestrians ride along with a flock of sheep. Swallows fly above. In keeping with the Netherlandish tradition, Antonello offers us a beautiful window out into a peaceful world. With this picture, Antonello firmly established himself in the Venetian art scene, which we'll discuss more deeply next episode. Antonello rose to such prominence in Venice in his later career that he was offered the position of court portraitist there, but he opted instead to return to his Sicilian hometown of Messina, where he painted until his death. This arresting image of the Virgin in the moment of the Annunciation is one of his last works. Here, Mary has been interrupted at her reading by Gabriel, but we don't see the archangel here. Perhaps we're meant to serve in his role. We can almost hear the sound of the crackling page as it turns midway. Mary looked slightly taken aback, her eyes lowered in careful contemplation of Gabriel's words. Her face is modeled and shaded delicately and impeccably, as are the naturalistic folds of her robes. This painting is a testament to Antonello's technical prowess in oils. He's grounded in the Netherlandish tradition, but doesn't hesitate to incorporate new Italian techniques that he had learned. Here, techniques involving light and shadow and color he would have learned from Venetian masters. And for this reason, it's often counterproductive to attempt to categorize artists like Antonello. His work is the beautiful product of a meeting of traditions. There's a third class of dialogues I'd like to highlight. Conversations between different media, whether in 2 dimensions or 3 or both. We've previously seen with the Ghent altarpiece how the outer wings would show painted sculptures in grisaille to save the patron from having to hire and pay a sculptor when just a painter would suffice. But artists increasingly began to play with this notion of medium, intentionally blurring boundaries between painting, sculpture, and other art forms. Rogier van der Weyden's Durán Madonna is a fabulous early example. The Virgin and Child sit in a Gothic niche with intricate tracery, which we also see in his classic Descent from the Cross from episode 2. And they're situated on a projection out toward us, which enhances the sense of three-dimensionality. I'm showing here an earlier sculpture of the Virgin and Child made for the Burgundian court. Notice the remarkable similarity in iconography, the placement of Mary's hands, her drapery. Originally, this sculpture, like many others of its time, would have been fully polychrome, multicolored, not unlike the figures in the painting. But unlike in the sculpture, Rogier's Christ Child fixates his gaze on the Bible. He's flipping the pages, but in what direction? Well, if the Virgin is reading it right side up, then he's flipping towards the beginning of the book, something very unusual to see. He even creases the pages. He's doing so with such energy. This flipping toward the beginning points to an association with Genesis, the first book of the Bible, which in turn alludes to the fall of man, ultimately linked to the original sin committed by Adam and Eve, and thus to Christ's sacrifice. So Rogier's experimenting with painting sculpturally, but sculptures themselves were often painted. Many works of art combined the two art forms on a massive scale, like this triptych by the Bavarian sculptor Veit Stoss, who was hired to the court of Krákow, then capital of Poland. This is actually the biggest Gothic altarpiece in the world, spanning 13 meters tall by 11 meters wide. The central panel here takes on the form of a box. It recedes, allowing for the placement of actual freestanding sculptures that each required entire sections of tree trunks. Between biblical narratives on the wings, we see Mary ascending to heaven, crowned by three-dimensional pinnacles, showing Mary's coronation as the Queen of Heaven. Completing this colossal triptych took 12 years. It was a collaborative effort between sculptors, metalsmiths, and painters. Now, paint is actually not very compatible with the rough surface of wood. It would be absorbed by pores in the wood. And so after the base sculpture was completed, layers of animal glue, linen, and gesso were applied to create a suitable surface. Sections that required gold leaf gilding would have to be further treated with glue and clay. And at the end, the finished product would be polished by rubbing. In comparison to a two-dimensional painting, this three-dimensional representation contributes a new immediacy, a new sense of imposing drama to the biblical narrative. Like with Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise, each panel feels like a true window into the story, and the presence of freestanding statues gives it so much depth, imbues it with so much life and vigor. Veit Stoss brings new immediacy and consummate elegance to an otherwise very familiar subject of devotion. In Italy, the practice of polychromy sculpture, decorating sculptures with pigments, was largely abandoned with Donatello. In Northern Europe, it was with the wood carvings of another Bavarian sculptor, Tilman Riemenschneider, in the late 15th century. This bishop is a section of a linden tree. Riemenschneider adds only simple notes of black for definition, and the realism is quite simply overwhelming. The drapery, but also the wrinkles, the emotional intensity of facial expression, the delicate decorations on the mitre headdress, it's immaculate. But this isn't actually a sculpture in the round. It's a high relief once affixed to the side of an altarpiece, and so the back is left unfinished. Compare Riemenschneider's limewood seated bishop to this painted one by Michael Pacher, a painter and sculptor from a German-speaking region in northern Italy called Tyrol. Notice in this panel from an altarpiece, Pacher includes these Gothic statuettes and architectural elements. This blending of art forms is a good example of an Italian concept that's really a universal debate that's ongoing at this time in Europe, the paragone, or rivalry between painting and sculpture. And so painting and sculpture are linked inextricably, but together they relate intimately to another often overshadowed domain of craftsmanship, the decorative arts, and in particular, metalwork. If you glanced at this triptych of the crucifixion from far away, you might initially think it was painted, but the elements actually project out in 3 dimensions, made using bone, mother of pearl, and enamel resin on gilded silver. The angels literally float, and Christ is literally nailed to the cross. And I just love the small sun and crescent moon on the upper corners of the central panel, physically crowning this gem-like treasure, are medallions and a silver statuette of Christ. Look also at the base. This portion of silver is engraved. It's been incised with a sharp steel blade called a burin to show saints. And as if the front wasn't precious enough, the artist has chosen to decorate the reverse with a Last Supper scene. So in the closed conformation of this triptych, the shrine showing the crucifixion would be protected with engraved silver on both sides. This is another extraordinary and surprising multimedia devotional object from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It measures only 35 centimeters long. It's a crib fashioned out of wood, complete with a removable pillow and bed sheets. It's one of the most fascinating examples of polychrome sculpture from 15th century Northern Europe. But who's this crib made for? Well, we see 4 angels perched atop the bedposts, but also elaborately carved images of the Nativity and the adoration of the Magi. It points to one person only, the Christ child. A doll of the baby Jesus would have once rested on this fine bed. This crib comes from a community of Beguine, a semi-monastic order of women. Unlike nuns, they didn't take vows, but they did lead lives of piety and simplicity. They would have worshipped this object by handling it, singing to it. Those bells, actually, would have served as accompaniment for a hymn. So this is very much a tactile and auditory object, as much as it is a visual one. And that's the kind of multisensory experience these artists so cleverly furnished for their patrons. So far, all the art forms we've covered in this series, painting, sculpture, decorative arts, architecture, are ancient art forms. But in the 1430s and 40s, the German craftsman Johannes Gutenberg pioneered a new technology for Europeans, printing, and with it emerged a new art form, printmaking. At first, printmaking was used to supply illustrations for printed books. It enabled the mass production and dissemination of humanist texts and treatises like Alberti's De Pictura. It was also a convenient way to produce playing cards. But soon, the print became recognized as a general art form for public consumption. Purchasing a print was much cheaper than commissioning an altarpiece. Prints were accessible, democratic. One common type of printmaking is called engraving. It's a delicate process where you use a burin to cut a design into a polished metal plate, usually copper for its smoothness. Then you spread ink onto the plate to fill those incisions, and once the ink settles, the plate is flipped over onto a sheet of paper. The mirror image of the design is thus printed onto that paper, completing the engraving. This engraving shows the extraordinary ability of the medium to convey the same level of precision and even lighting as texture as painting, just without any color. It's by the leading 15th century engraver Martin Schongauer, and it shows the hermit monk St. Anthony resisting the taunts and temptations of demons in the wilderness. These grotesque creatures and their fanciful composite anatomies remind me of Bermejo's conception of the devil. We see a spiny fish with a tubular nose and a stinger about to hit the saint with a tree branch, a rebel angel clawing at his hair, a winged insect-like beast with the head of an angry bird of prey. Look at St. Anthony's robes, what Schongauer's done to convey shadow there. He uses these parallel and intersecting lines, a technique called cross-hatching. The density of this cross-hatching intimates intensity of shadow, and this realism was Schongauer's claim to fame. He'd later go on to train Albrecht Dürer, the preeminent painter and printmaker of the German High Renaissance. Unexpectedly, there was much dialogue between the arts of painting and printmaking, including across the Alps. This small Italian panel is clearly a copy of Schongauer's earlier print, and it's actually attributed to the 13-year-old Michelangelo, which, if true, makes this his first known work, done in the workshop of his master, Domenico Ghirlandaio. It's interesting to compare the two renditions. What do you find more effective about each? Do you find one more compelling than the other? Michelangelo adds this panoramic landscape to provide context for this horrific event, making it even more jarring. The dark coloration of Anthony's robes makes him the unequivocal focal point, while in Schongauer's monochrome print, the beasts are given kind of equal emphasis. This kind of discourse about the superiority of certain media in certain situations increasingly captivated and motivated Renaissance artists. And I think this is the beauty of appreciating the diversity of media and the extensiveness of dialogue in 15th century European art. It's eye-opening to move beyond rigid classifications like Flemish painting or German sculpture, beyond the silos of Flanders and Italy. You have everything from a Flemish oil painting that imitates sculpture, to a colossal polychrome multimedia triptych by a Bavarian sculptor working in Poland, to an ivory salt cellar made in West Africa for the Portuguese market, to a South Italian painter with a Flemish training honing linear perspective in Venice. This is the richness of Renaissance art. This is Renaissance Europe in conversation. Next time, we focus on the Renaissance in Venice. There, cross-pollination between three brothers, Mantegna, Giovanni Bellini, and Gentile Bellini, all painters, firmly positioned the city and its environs at the forefront of the 15th century art scene. They explored the properties and possibilities of light and leveraged painting as a diplomatic tool in the tense arena of Mediterranean politics. I'll see you then.